Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Dominic Cummings saying that the Prime Minister came back after he was sick, saying what is going on with the care homes, what is happening, why are these people dying? And Dominic Cummings said that Matt Hancock had told him that a ring of steel had been thrown around these care homes to protect the vulnerable residents inside, but that wasn't the case. This is what he had to say.
We were told categorically in March that people would be tested before they went back to care homes. We only subsequently found out that that hadn't happened. Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
And that really gives you a sense of what was happening or not happening inside government at the time. The fact that there were people, elderly, vulnerable people inside hospitals who were being discharged back into care homes when Mr. Dominic Cummings said later that the virus was left to seed and spread like fire, as we know, through these care homes. One of the biggest single scandals of this pandemic, and Dominic Cummings there laying the blame firmly at Matt Hancock's door.
Ashish Joshi there in the newsroom for us. Thanks very much indeed. Well, we are going to have a special programme coming up at 8 o'clock this evening where we will go through all of the key moments and have full analysis of today's extraordinary testimony by Dominic Cummings. That is Dominic Cummings, a Sky News special with Jonathan Samuels at 8 o'clock tonight. Well, we've heard 6 hours or more of evidence from Dominic Cummings so far. They are taking a short break in the committee room. They are due back at 3:05 with yet more evidence, focusing in the latter session on the decision-making around autumn lockdowns. Why did the Prime Minister delay? We know that there will be more explosive evidence coming up from Dominic Cummings as they resume, and we will bring it all to you live here on Sky News.
Partners, look at your man. Back at me. Now back at your man down there. He's probably wearing cotton pants. I'm wearing Step 1 from Bamboo. It breathes. Ultra glide panels stop them from chafing and riding up. And this 3D pouch keeps everything in place. There's a first pair guarantee. Love them or they're free. Is he happy yet? Tell him to go to step1.life.
Simply Cook. 3 pots, 20 minutes, 1 incredible meal. Claim your £3 trial box now.
1-year-old Biniam doesn't yet know that he's been born with a cleft. He doesn't yet know how it will affect his life if it isn't treated. But it won't be long before he finds out. Because soon he'll notice that no one wants to play with him. Forced to hide away, Biniam will become completely isolated. He'll find it almost impossible just to eat, just to speak. And Biniam will start to believe his whole life will feel this sad and lonely. Right now, so many innocent babies need cleft treatment, but their parents simply can't afford it. Please, will you help give a child like Biniam a better future? Just call 0800 144 5326 or text SMILE9 to 70456 and give £2 a month to Smile Train. You'll help a child get the simple cleft treatment that will change their life forever. You can help give them a happy and healthy childhood. Help them laugh, smile and play. and give them the life that every child deserves. Just call 0800 144 5326, text SMILE9 to 70456, or go online and give £2 a month to Smile Train. Because without you, a child like Biniam will face a life filled with sadness and pain.
Where are we? Someplace magical.
Get ready to be razzle-dazzled.
We were never going to be the Waltons.
I don't need us to be the Waltons, hon. I'd make do with the Munsters at this point. Or the Manson family. At least they had a shared interest.
It's one of the great kicks. Bolden. There's your champion. Brilliant pass. What a race.
Get ready for an action-packed summer that's only live once on Sky Sports.
This is Sky News with me, Sarah Hewson, coming up at 3 o'clock. When the public needed us, the government failed. Dominic Cummings delivers a damning assessment of the response to Covid-19. In explosive evidence to MPs, the Prime Minister's former chief advisor said claims the government put a shield around care homes were complete nonsense, and Health Secretary Matt Hancock should have been sacked.
It was criminal, disgraceful behaviour that caused serious harm.
Did the government fall disastrously short, Prime Minister? Do you apologise for the mistakes made?
The Prime Minister hits back at the claims after Mr Cummings says it's crackers that Mr Johnson is in charge. And Mr Cummings admits that his trip to Barnard Castle in the first lockdown undermined public confidence and was a disaster for the government. Hello, good afternoon. Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, has delivered a damning assessment of the UK's response to Covid-19, saying when the public needed us most, the government failed. Speaking to MPs on the Health and Science Select Committees, Mr Cummings says it is completely crackers that Mr Johnson is Prime Minister, claiming that he had initially dismissed Covid as a scare story. He described the government as lions led by donkeys and said Health Secretary Matt Hancock should have been sacked. Well, let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, we've had 6 hours of evidence. We're expecting the committee to resume again in the next few minutes. But what is your verdict so far?
Well, firstly, sir, there'll be plenty more when the committee does resume, because we haven't even got on to what happened in autumn around that second lockdown and whether the Prime Minister ordered that too late. So plenty more to come. But in terms of what we've had, what an extraordinary, astonishing set of evidence. And for me, what stands out is this: when Dominic Cummings was asked about when there would be a public inquiry, should it be brought forward, he said, in his view, tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die. And really, in terms of all of this evidence, all the psychodrama around his relationship with Boris Johnson, around what he did or didn't say about that trip to Durham, it's about what decisions were made and what material impact did they have on people's lives and their families. And that consideration by him that tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die, well, that is a very, very difficult question and statement for the government to answer. And whatever your view is, I would argue, about Dominic Cummings' credibility, he was in the room when these decisions were being taken. And today he is lifting the veil on some of the chaos that was going on and the lack of preparedness within government and the consequences of that on care homes. That really stood out, that he said it was nonsense that there was a ring of steel around care homes. People were being discharged to care homes having not been tested. He said the government fell disastrously short of standards the public have a right to accept. He says the government were asleep at the wheel during February and accepts his responsibility in that. And he said that in terms of the Prime Minister, that he went on holiday for 2 weeks in February and dismissed COVID as a scare story, likening it to the swine flu. Very critical there of the Prime Minister. He then goes on to talk about Matt Hancock and how he and the Cabinet Secretary had advised that Matt Hancock should be fired for his failures, as Dominic Cummings saw it, over COVID. Matt Hancock will be appearing before this committee in 2 weeks' time to give his version of events. And also he went on to say it was crackers that Boris Johnson was in charge, and he suggested in evidence that Mr. Johnson was unfit to be Prime Minister. So a really excoriating attack from an advisor that was once the right hand of the Prime Minister, now just putting out what he says really was going on behind the scenes in Number 10 over the past year.
Yeah, painting a picture of a government without a plan. No plan for lockdown, no plan for testing, no plan for PPE, no plan for shielding, no plan for social care. It went on and on, Beth. And ultimately, this session is about learning the lessons. That is something that Boris Johnson has said it isn't the right time to be doing. And what we're going to look at this afternoon is where the lessons could have been learned before the autumn lockdown and the second wave.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm just trying to I can't find it here. The government's view is that we should be looking forward, that they are dealing with the pandemic. But questions around that second lockdown, it was well documented. I wrote and spoke about it at the time that the Prime Minister had been advised to kick in that circuit breaker at the end of October. He refused to do so, only to end up having to go into a lockdown later in November, and doing so reluctantly. And he is alleged to have said that he would rather see bodies piled high than ever go into a third lockdown. We, of course, did go into a third lockdown in January. He has publicly denied that. Dominic Cummings will no doubt be asked about that at the committee today. But if you think about how uncomfortable that testimony was in terms of the first lockdown, January into March, what was happening, why wasn't the government prepared? You know, you heard what he said about Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, saying that we are absolutely expletive, I can't use the word, but in big trouble, that there wasn't a plan within Whitehall to deal with the pandemic. We're now going to go in a few minutes into what happened in September, October, November, when we ended up in a second lockdown. Remember the tier system, and then into December. And I think Dominic Cummings has definitely put out a view that he was pressing the Prime Minister to go into lockdown more quickly, and he will give that evidence. And I think that that could be very personally uncomfortable for the Prime Minister when that set of evidence is presented.
Beth, he also talked about border policy. This is something we're still debating right up to the current day. And he said that there wasn't a border policy because the PM didn't want one. What did he mean by that?
Well, just in terms of the border policy, Dominic Cummings has been making the case that he wanted the borders to be shut down, that the Prime Minister was reluctant to do that. You have seen in recent days the controversy over that around the India variant. Ed Conway been doing some great work on that, about why was India not shut down when Bangladesh and Pakistan was. Was it because the Prime Minister was trying to do a trade trip there? But Dominic Cummings, highly critical of the government's policy around borders. It's still controversial now, but it's not just the policy around borders. It was also about track and trace. He said that Matt Hancock was trying to interfere with the programme because he had publicly said that he wanted to hit 100,000 tests a day target, that meant that project got delayed. He talked about PPE. He says Matt Hancock said that it was all ready in March only, or it was under control, only to find out in late April that it wasn't. A series of problems that he pointed out in terms of government policy and just how behind the scenes things were not really organised, and that it was being made on the hoof.
And as for Matt Hancock, I mean, he was mentioned on numerous occasions, Beth. It was an absolute evisceration of the Health Secretary. He's going to be giving evidence in a couple of weeks. But how damaging is this for him?
Well, it's extremely damaging. You have this former advisor who was in the heart of government in those decisions. Whatever you think of him, he was in the room with a handful of people making these decisions. And he's gone on record to say that the Cabinet Secretary, he was then Mark Sedwill, told the Prime Minister that he did not have confidence in the Health Secretary or in what he said in terms of how he was managing and actioning policy around key things such as care homes and PPE, and also his role in track and trace and actually hindering the process, not helping it. These are very, very serious allegations. Matt Hancock will, of course, will want to answer them, but it is very difficult for him indeed that in terms of his criticisms, Mr. Cummings has really honed in on the health secretary, and you can see by how he speaks about Matt Hancock that Dominic Cummings holds Matt Hancock in complete contempt.
And what about Dominic Cummings himself, Beth? Because it was put to him on repeated occasions by those on the committee that he was a man in a position of huge power here, perhaps the second most powerful man in Downing Street. What of his role and acknowledgement of that?
Yes, sir, and you're absolutely right on that, which is he was in the room making the decisions. I think what has been interesting is the way in which he has actually taken personal responsibility. On a number of occasions, he has said, I take fault, I wish I'd done something sooner, I accept my responsibility, I apologise for that, I regret that. And in doing so, he's not just pushing the blame onto other people, he's taking responsibility for what he thought went wrong too.
And the committee is resuming.
Asking Mr. Cummings just to give us a brief summary of what were the key decisions taken during the autumn.
Well, I guess the most significant were that mid-September, Sage and Patrick Vallance advised that we take rapid action and do some kind of short, sharp burst because of where the numbers were going. Prime Minister decided not to do that. We then went round the houses on that decision and then ended up doing it on the 31st of October. In the meantime, the government kind of careered around all over the shop trying to do these local lockdowns and other things. But in the end, it didn't work. I mean, is it useful if I kind of spell out what the actual meetings were when, so that you can...
I think that would be helpful, and then Jeremy Hunt is going
essentially
to
what happened is, in the week of the around about the 15th of September, I think, is it the 18th, this is the Friday? I think so. Essentially, so Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty came to number 10 and they said, we and Sage think that we need to consider a kind of 2-week or possibly longer lockdown. Bear in mind that back in the summer, when we were discussing the whole kind of reopening plan, I asked Chris Whitty, what do you think the chances are that we'll have R over 1 again by September and back to problems? He said, I think that if before the schools go back, probably R will be below 1, but it's over 50% likely that R will be over 1 if you bring the schools back in September. Many of us had said in the summer to the Prime Minister, do not tell everyone, get back to work. Don't do this whole everyone go back to work thing and COVID's over and whatnot. But at that point, his main concern was about the economy. So over July, August, obviously, the whole impetus of the government was to try and pretend that we could get back to normal. So 17th, Patrick and Chris come to number 10 and say we should lock down. I say to the Prime Minister, quote, the lesson of the first wave was earlier the better when dealing with exponentials like this, unquote. Then on the Friday, there was a long discussion of it with the PM. And essentially at the end of that, he decided we're not going to do anything. So I said, listen, we all lived through the March horror, and I've got a dreadful feeling about this, that we're making the same mistake. I said, before you make a final decision on this, I want to do something that sounds a bit weird. I want to have another meeting on Monday where what we do is we imagine the meeting is the end of October, and we'll have all the documents presented to you. So I'm talking about kind of Monday, the 21st, I think it is. So the meeting itself will be on Monday, the 21st of September, but we will set the whole thing in the future at the end of October. And we will look at the data with what is our best guess that this is what the situation is going to be like at the end of October, and talk through all of that. Because if you're going to look at that then and then decide to lock down, we should do it now. That's the whole lesson of March. The Cabinet Secretary says, I completely agree, that's a very good idea, we'll get the data team on it, etc., etc. So the data team, which in February, March didn't really exist, it was Ben Warner. By now, there was a really, really good team of a sort of mix of officials and SPADs in number 10. They crunched all of these numbers with Sage data and other stuff over that weekend. Then on the Sunday evening, there was a meeting with a combination of Sage scientists and some external people. By this point, unfortunately, the Prime Minister was listening to various people who were saying things like, there's already herd immunity in the population, there won't be any second wave, etc., etc. So we had this meeting in the Cabinet room Sunday evening. Patrick and Chris gave their view. A guy called Hemigan and a woman from Oxford called Professor Gupta, I think it was, gave the kind of don't lock down view. John Edmonds said, who was on Sage, surely we're going to learn the lessons of March. Here's what the data's going to be. You are not going to, the only logic of not doing a lockdown then will be that you're not going to do it at all. There's no way that you're going to make that decision. Just do it now, otherwise it's all going to be worse. Prime Minister said, I'm not persuaded of that. We then had the meeting where, the kind of hypothetical meeting in the future, and there was a brilliant young woman called Catherine Cutts, who we brought in from outside Whitehall, who kind of presented all of this data. So we set it all out to the Prime Minister. Here's the stuff. So remember, there's a huge contrast at this point to what I was describing in March. In March, no testing data, no proper data system, me scribbling things on a whiteboard with an iPhone. By now, you've got a completely professional team really on it. They've got all the testing data, they've got all the NHS data, it's all really clear. They set it all out. And it's just, from some of our point of view, just completely obvious that in this hypothetical point, 5-6 weeks hence, when we're looking at that, we are now days from the point at which you've got no further, you're going to have to act now, or you've crossed the tripwire whereby the NHS is going to get smashed again. That's what all the data is showing us. And the Prime Minister wasn't persuaded about this. And I said to him, the whole lesson of what happened before is that by delaying, the lockdown came later, it had to be more severe, it had to last longer. The economic disruption is even worse anyway, and will have killed God knows how many thousand people in the meantime who've caught COVID, who wouldn't have caught it if we act now. Surely we've got to learn the lessons from the past. And Prime Minister decided no and said, basically, just going to hit and hope.
Let's pause at that point and we'll go into some detail. I'm going to start with Carol Monaghan before I go to Jeremy Hunt. Carol.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Cummings, you'd said earlier in your evidence today that you should have been hitting the panic button back in February, March time. So we're now talking September. We've learned lots of lessons. As you say, we've got a handle on things.
Yeah.
Were you hitting the panic button in September?
Yes.
And was the Prime Minister aware of how seriously you were taking things at that point?
Yes, at that point there was no. So as you know, as I explained before, in February, March, I was very frightened, is the only way to describe it, about hitting the panic button, because I was worried, what if I'm wrong and the people telling me that the official plan is wrong are wrong, and the data was completely hopeless, etc. By this time, it was a completely different situation. Basically, all credible, serious people, in my opinion, were saying essentially the same thing. So I was very, very clear with him about it.
And so you were pressing for a circuit breaker lockdown in September. So if the Prime Minister wasn't persuaded, in your words, of the importance of this, whose advice was he taking?
He wasn't taking any advice. He was just making his own decision that he was going to ignore the advice.
So did his Cabinet agree with his decisions?
Cabinet wasn't involved or asked.
Did you hear anything from Cabinet members about these decisions?
There were sort of different views. I've been very critical of Matt Hancock, but I think Hancock agreed with me actually in September about acting then.
Okay, and
but there wasn't any formal Cabinet meeting to discuss it, or if it was a purely Potemkin exercise. It wasn't a kind of real discussion that actually affected.
So all of these decisions were entirely the Prime Minister's?
On the September lockdown, correct.
Now, I understand the meeting with SAGE representative and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister back in September, where they were told of the importance of that lockdown.
Yes, I was there, yeah.
You were there as well? Mm-hmm. Okay. What was the Chancellor's view on this?
The Chancellor's view was the Department for Health, who want to do this, have no plan. There is no plan for what to do. Like we've just gone through a whole thing where we had all of these arguments in June, July, and some people, like Dom said, get back to work, don't just try and go hell for leather for the economy, but you decided to do it. And now the Department of Health is suddenly hitting the panic button again and saying, well, we've got to stop for 2 weeks. And then what? Then are we going to tell everyone to go back to work again? And then what? Then 2 weeks later to say the opposite? Like, there is no plan. There is no coherence to anything.
So knowing that the Department for Health was chaotic in its approach here, was the economic arguments, were they outweighing everything else at this point?
For the Prime Minister, yes.
And there was talk, and certainly the Scottish Government were pushing hard following that SAGE advice for an extension of the furlough scheme. Why was that not discussed more seriously at that point? Because it was only eventually extended at the very last minute.
I can't remember all the kind of time details on timing with that, I'm afraid, but I know all the way along, Rishi and his team took the whole issue about 30. Remember, they came up with the idea. It wasn't us in number 10. They came up with the idea to do it. And once the Prime Minister said at each stage, I'm going to do X and I've made a decision, the Chancellor always extremely competently and extremely ably and effectively kind of rode in and said, right, here's the economic package to go along with it, and he made it happen.
Do you think if a different Prime Minister had been in number 10, things would have been managed in a different way?
Undoubtedly, yes.
So his predecessors?
You mean, what do I think each of his predecessors would have done in that situation?
If it had been David Cameron, Theresa May.
I mean, it's all a bit hypothetical. God only knows what each of them would do. But I would say, if you took anybody at random from the kind of top 1% competent people in this country and presented them with the situation, they would have behaved differently to how the Prime Minister behaved.
So, if we're describing his behaviour at that point, was it driven by arrogance, complacency, or was it something more sinister?
No, he just didn't. I think there's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown. His argument after that happened was, literally, quote, "I should have been the mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open." That's what he said on many, many occasions. So he didn't think in July or September, thank goodness we were pushed, thank goodness we did the first lockdown, it was obviously the right thing to do, etc., etc. His argument then was, we shouldn't have done the first lockdown, and I'm not going to make the same mistake again.
So that does sound like arrogance.
I don't know if arrogance is the right thing. It's just as I said in the earlier session, the Prime Minister took the view in January, February that economic harm caused by action against COVID was going to be more damaging to the country than COVID. And we could not persuade him that if you basically took the view of let it rip and not worry about COVID, you would get not just all the health disasters, but you would also then get a huge economic disaster, because if people are faced with not having any health system, which is what they were faced with in March if we'd gone down Plan A, or what we would have been faced with if we hadn't finally put the brakes on in October, then people are going to lock themselves down out of terror. And we could never persuade him of this argument. He also essentially thought that he'd been gamed on the numbers in the first lockdown. And he thought the NHS would somehow have got through all the stuff about the NHS.
Was he not concerned about the number of people that died? I mean, did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands, or it's only killing 80-year-olds?
There's been a few different versions of these stories knocking around. There was a version of it in the Sunday Times, which was not accurate, but the version that the BBC reported was accurate.
And you heard that?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Okay, and next question.
That was not then, that was not in September though. That was immediately after he finally made the decision to do the lockdown on the 31st of October.
Okay, next question. You showed us a whiteboard picture, and one of the phrases on it that I think has caused some concern is, who do we not save? What was the answer to that?
Well, that was asking the obvious question at that point. At that point, it was too late to stop disaster on the 13th of March, was my view, and the people who I thought, figured this out best view. So the comment on there was essentially like, we're already partly over the cliff. Like, who is not going to be saved in this situation? Like, have we figured that out? Who's most vulnerable, etc., etc., etc.
What was the final straw that has prompted you to come and give evidence such as you are today? Because some would say for a government or Prime Minister advisor that discretion is important, but you've disclosed everything today. So what has prompted that?
I think a couple of things. I think the scale of the disaster is so big that people can't wait. People need to understand how the government failed them when they needed it. People need to understand that now. Who knows what other kind of problems might come along in the next few years that could easily have exactly the same consequences, because critical as I've been of the Prime Minister, in no way, shape or form can you say this is just his fault. If you just shuffled him around, or a couple of ministers, or Hancock, everything would suddenly work. It wouldn't. These failings are programmed by the wiring of the system. And if you have something this bad, and you've got tens and tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die, and massive economic destruction, the way that we've had it, that didn't need to happen, if we'd sorted things out earlier, everyone in this country needs to face the reality of this. And secondly, it's become clear over the last couple of months that, contrary to when I spoke to the Prime Minister about it last year, in the summer, he has clearly changed his mind and is now desperate not to face up to this and not to learn the lessons. I think because of the disaster in the autumn.
So, talking about not learning the lessons, can I ask you just some quick yes-no answers, and then I'll be done, Chair. So I appreciate that you did leave in November, but were you surprised by the government delays in putting India on the red list?
No, not surprised at all. It's completely in character with number 10.
And are you surprised by the confusion on the current travel arrangements with green, amber and red countries?
I'm afraid it's déjà vu all over again.
Who is now advising the Prime Minister?
Don't know.
And are you surprised that people are being encouraged to travel this year?
I'm not on top of it enough to have a kind of a sensible view, I'm afraid, in terms of whether or not people should be travelling. I haven't followed
and last year?
People. Well, I think lots of things that we did last summer, as I said, I think were, I said at the time, I thought were big mistakes. Lots of people said to the Prime Minister last year, do not listen to the media or screaming at you about get back to work, physically go back to work, because as soon as you get to September, you're going to be screaming back at everyone again, work from home again. And everyone's going to think that you've lost the plot and the government's lost the plot, and they'll be right. But that was one of the many arguments that I lost on this whole thing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cummings. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Carol. I can't remember whether you said, were you opposed to Eat Out to Help Out?
I was opposed to the general strategy that the Prime Minister set out. I think once the Prime Minister said, everyone get back to work, everyone get the economy going and everything else, then things like that are logical. The problem is his fundamental decision about the strategy was wrong.
But in the particular, did you advise against it? Did you advise anyone against it?
I can't really remember conversations, to be honest, about Eat Out to Help Out specifically.
It's quite a big initiative, wasn't it?
To be honest, in the grand scheme of things, it didn't seem like that at the time, no.
So you don't recall having any conversation?
Oh, no, I was definitely in meetings in which it was discussed, but at that point I basically lost the argument on the approach.
So because the strategy was not the one you wanted, you didn't raise any objection to actions that were consistent with the strategy? Specifically on Eat Out to Help Out, I don't remember, to be honest, exactly what the conversations were that I had on it. Before that happened, that was a consequence of a strategic decision made by the Prime Minister, which was, we've killed the economy, we've got to get the economy back, COVID's in the past, there won't be a second wave, get everything open. Sure.
Me, the Director of Communications, the Cabinet Secretary, other people said, hang on a second, what about all the following objections to this plan? We lost that argument, the Prime Minister made a decision. Once that happens, then lots of other things naturally flow, like, for example, students coming back in September, and all that sort of thing, which clearly, if you'd taken a different view of it, you would never have done.
Okay, so you didn't oppose the Eat Out to Help Out because it was consistent with the strategy?
I wouldn't say that. I honestly can't even remember what I said about Eat Out to Help Out. I didn't pay huge attention to Eat Out to Help Out.
Okay, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you. Now, you've been very clear that the Prime Minister rejected the idea of circuit breaker towards the end of September. Of course, what he would say is that they did have that circuit breaker in Wales, but they still had to go into the November lockdown. So many people say that it was actually inevitable anyway. The seeds had already been sown by that stage. I just want to go through some of the things that could also have contributed to the need for a second lockdown. Now, you don't recall opposing Eat Out to Help Out, which is something that a lot of people have talked about. I think you just said then, but just correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't oppose students going back to university at the beginning of September, is that right?
Yes, I advised against that.
You did advise against that?
Yes.
You did, okay. What about...
I didn't say that I was opposed or pro Eat Out to Help Out. I just thought it was part of a plan which on a grand scheme was wrong. And I don't remember if I even gave a view specifically on Eat Out to Help Out.
But you did, for example, advise against telling people to go back to work.
Yes.
You thought that was wrong.
Yes.
But it's just that, and you did advise against students going back in September.
Yes.
You did. And not sure about Eat Out to Help Out. Can I ask you about the high numbers of infections that were circulating on NHS hospital wards? So NHS data now says that about 8,700 people died having picked up infections inside hospitals, and we were obviously very sorry to hear about your uncle earlier on. Did you advise that we needed to bring forward the weekly testing of NHS staff, which wasn't actually introduced until November?
Yes.
And
there were many meetings on testing of NHS staff. One of the things that I spent a huge amount of time on was trying to get these LAMP and lateral flow tests going, so that NHS staff could basically have like a test a day for everybody in the NHS if they wanted to. It was clear that that was technically possible, it was organisationally possible, and it should be done, and I did all I could to try and accelerate that.
And who resisted that happening? Because it took a long time. I mean, we did care homes in July. That was actually, I think it didn't actually get operational until September, but it was promised in July. But it wasn't even promised for the NHS until November.
I think just in general on LAMP and lateral flow, there was just this same kind of incredibly conservative attitude and a kind of, well, if we just do PCR, everyone knows where they are and no one's going to criticise us. As soon as you do something new inside the civil service, you know, if it works, no one gets any credit, and if it doesn't work, you get the blame. So there's just this huge kind of reverse ratchet all the time against this. It took huge effort from Number 10 to try and push this through, and that's after we had the Prime Minister supportive, the Cabinet Secretary supportive, the Hancock and personally supportive, and we had a whole bunch of great people involved. I mean, to give you an example of how hard this was, after I spoke myself to some of the scientists involved with getting the mass testing going, and they described all of the problems, and I spoke to the team in the test and trace, I sat down in the Cabinet room with the Cabinet Secretary and the head of commercial and the head of HR for the civil service and another whole bunch of literally the top officials. And the Cabinet Secretary and I said to all of them, this is a war. This is a wartime measure. This could make all the difference between how this country survives, hundreds of billions of pounds between now and the vaccines hopefully coming on stream in Q1 next year. Any rules, forget. Procurement things, throw them away. HR rules in particular, throw them away, because there was huge problems with recruiting the team. So you can't really have much more than the PM's main advisor and the Cabinet Secretary all saying that. 2 weeks later, all the people just came back to us and said nothing's changed. We had to do the whole thing again, and the Cabinet Secretary had to threaten people with being fired. So there was a whole huge just general resistance to this thing because it seemed so new and risky, and you've got these PCR tests where the accuracy rate is very, very high, and then a lot of people couldn't get their head around the stats of the mass tests.
But the thing that's puzzling about weekly testing of NHS staff is that there were repeated calls in this place from lots and lots of different people to get on with it from the start of the summer on.
Yep.
And it wasn't even announced as a plan until November. So it wasn't like anyone said, we want to do weekly testing of NHS staff. It was actually not announced until November, and then the promise was to try and get it done by, I think, the first week of December. And so why did it take so long even to accept that that should be the plan, given that we now know so many people picked up infections in hospitals?
With respect, that I don't think that's... So I'm not arguing with you about the announcement. I can't remember now when definite announcements were made. But I was having meetings in April about testing NHS staff on as fast a basis as possible. I had meetings in July about getting the mass tests out. And I had literally meetings almost every day of my government career from the 1st of September till the day I left on mass testing and this subject. So you
wanted to do it. That's the point. It just wasn't announced as an objective. That's
Number 10 was pushing it. The team in the test and trace team that we built was pushing for it. That was definitely one of our core goals. Yes.
Okay. And then just last one from me on this section. You said earlier that you should have resigned probably in the spring and definitely in September. You did actually end up resigning at the end of the year. Can you understand how to some people it looks like you resigned after losing a power struggle in Number 10, but you didn't resign over issues that cost thousands of lives, and how that makes people angry?
Well, I mean, there's so many crazy stories about what happened in Number 10 that are mostly untrue. So all I'd say to people is don't believe what you read in the newspapers about things like that. I think that...
so your resignation had nothing to do with Lee Kay not being appointed to the position you wanted, things like that?
So my resignation was definitely connected to the fact that the Prime Minister's girlfriend was trying to change a whole bunch of different appointments in Number 10 and appoint her friends to particular jobs. In particular, she was trying to overturn the outcome of an official process about hiring a particular job in a way which was not only completely unethical, but was also clearly illegal. I thought the whole process about how the Prime Minister was behaving at that point was appalling, and all of that was definitely part of why I went. However, this had all been, as I said to you, I had this conversation with him the night before my operation back in July. It was clear in July that our relations were very far from where they had been. And they took another terrible dive after the second lockdown in October, because the Prime Minister knew that I blamed him for the whole situation. And I did. And, you know, by the 31st of October, our relations were essentially already finished. The fact that his girlfriend also wanted rid of me was, you know, relevant, but not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem was, fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions and push other things through against his wishes. And he had the view that he was Prime Minister and I should just be doing as he wanted me to, and that's obviously not sustainable for very long. And I only stayed because I was desperate to try and push through action to stop as many people dying as I could do. Once the second lockdown had happened, it was on the 31st, then it was obvious that I was going to be gone within days. And remember, I'd already said that I was going to go by the Friday the 18th of December in July. So it was not really anything. The thing that I got wrong, and the thing that I terribly regret now, is on the Tuesday, the 22nd, after we'd done that theoretical meeting, set in the future 5-6 weeks, which I'd organised, and he saw all the data and he said that. At that point, I was already going in kind of 12 weeks anyway. What I ought to have done is said to him then, I'm resigning in 48 hours. We can do this one way, or we can do this the other way. If you announce that you're going to have a lockdown and take serious action now, I will leave, go quietly, we're all friends. If you don't, I'll call a press conference and say, the Prime Minister's making a terrible decision that's going to kill thousands of people. And I should have gambled on holding a gun to his head, essentially. And who knows if that would have worked or not, but fundamentally, it was kind of all upside, given that my role there was basically done at that point. So I apologise for not trying that. I should have done. I was dissuaded from it because people basically thought, well, maybe you can help reverse this decision over coming weeks. It's a constant problem. You stay because you think maybe you can change things. But in retrospect now, seeing how things played out, it's lots of things are quite difficult to figure out hypothetically, but there's no doubt in my mind now that I made a mistake and that I should have gambled in that week.
Thank you, Jeremy. Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cummings, I've listened carefully to your advice or your testimony around decision-making in September. But Sage's advice on the 21st of September had a short list of options, only one of which was a circuit breaker lockdown. Is it any wonder that the Prime Minister sought alternatives to lockdown, given the weakness of that advice?
Well, I think you can't really take the thing from, as we can see from March, often what's written down in Sage papers is not really very close to the conversations that are in the room. So with respect, I would say that your picture of what was presented to the Prime Minister is not accurate. Patrick Vallance was very, very clear. Chris Whitty was very clear. The data was extremely clear that unless you act, thousands of people are going to die.
So, sorry, Mr. Cummings, it says here in its September advice, Sage said a more effective response now may reduce the length of time for which some measures are required. May isn't will, is it?
The word may does not mean the same as the word will, no, but that's not what the conversation was in number 10.
Okay, all right. In your testimony and on social media, you talk about enabled few, many of whom, to quote you, are now gone or leaving or planning to leave, and the rest who are all disastrously wrong or useless and get the promotions. There doesn't seem to be any in between. Your world only really sees heroes and villains. Is it really that black and white?
No, of course not. But it is a basic problem inside the system that lots of very able people get weeded out from top jobs, and that lots of people who are not fit for them get promoted. That's a core problem in political parties and in the civil service.
Well, do you accept that there are some people who may be brilliant, but who are also difficult and flawed, and in the end are impossible to satisfy?
I didn't hear that very well.
So
there are some people who...
do you accept that some people who may be brilliant, but are also difficult and flawed, and in the end are impossible to satisfy?
Of course, but I mean, but if you're trying to get a team at the top of government to deal with crises, you have to try and get the best talent that this country has to offer. And you're going to, and different kinds of talent. You need people who can think through very hard problems in a quantitative way. You need people who can make decisions effectively, and you need people who can build things operationally at scale. And you need teams that can kind of bring these skills together and integrate them. And we didn't have that. I'm not suggesting, by the way, just so that we're completely clear, I am not putting myself in the category of good people who should be promoted at all. Quite the opposite. I regarded my own position there as like a weird quirk of history, and my goal in January was to try and recruit a whole bunch of people who were much smarter than me and much better able than me to deal with government problems, so that I could make myself redundant, which I said publicly, which I believed.
Okay, just one final question. I just want to return to your earlier comments about not being focused on coronavirus until a relatively late stage. One journalist has posted a message from someone who was working in Number 10 at the time, and with apologies for the language, it reads, "Disingenuous little fucker. The reason he wasn't paying attention is that his plan to derail Boris by pulling off his putsch."
Okay, Paul, I don't want any repetition of that language. You can edit it.
Okay.
And our apologies for the language you've just heard during this evidence session as MPs questioned Dominic Cummings.
In every post with power was undone by the reality of the situation. I've never seen such a squirming nest of vicious contradiction embodied in a single individual. What's your response to that?
I don't quite understand the accusation, I'm afraid. What is it about February that supposedly I did?
Well, I guess it's saying that you're distracted by, you say your focus wasn't on COVID until the back end of February, despite the fact that the WHO had already determined this was an emergency, and you were distracted with other things. The accusation is that you were distracted by placing your own acolytes in every post with power, and that was undone by the reality of the situation. Quite frankly, Mr. Cummings, you have to work with other people. And I guess that's the accusation, that you didn't work well with others.
Well, I think I worked well with some people. I didn't necessarily work well with others. Different people have different kinds of temperaments. I think I would stress that lots of the things that you read in the media about me are not correct. I would point out that on quite a few occasions I've built teams that have been successful because I know how to build teams and I know how to manage them well. The media stories about all kinds of things and about how relations were with civil servants and whatnot are 99% nonsense, and I would advise that you don't listen to them.
Okay, we'll go to Taiwo Awatemi.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings, do you agree, do you have any reasons to believe that the Prime Minister may have been distracted from leading the national response to the COVID pandemic because of its own personal financial interest?
I don't know exactly what you mean. It's certainly the case that in February he had a string. Obviously, I mean, as a matter of public record, he was distracted by. He was finalising his divorce. His girlfriend wanted to announce being pregnant, an engagement, and his finances and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, certainly in February he had a very difficult time mid-February in his private life, for sure.
So what I'm trying to get at is, given the fact that the Prime Minister is currently writing a book, the fact that he has reportedly spent time seeking private donations to fund his own lifestyle, do you think that that is a useful way for a Prime Minister to spend his time, given the fact that we were in a public health crisis?
Well, obviously, I think that the Prime Minister's focus should be on the Prime Minister's job. I made clear before this meeting my views on what he was doing regarding other things in number 10, but I don't think today's the day to go into that sort of stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. Just moving on to communications. Do you think that senior medical officers such as Professor Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallant, working within the government were ever used during the evening press conference as political props to present greater plausibility to the government's COVID-19 messaging, even when the message wasn't clear or ineffective?
I certainly believe that the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, used Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty as shields for himself, yes. And he used the whole "we're following the science" as a way so that he could always say, well, if things go wrong, we'll blame the scientists and it's not my fault. I think I saw him discuss that with the Prime Minister, and I think it was one of the many appalling things that Hancock did.
And do you think that that was an acceptable way to use the time of senior medical officers, given the fact that we were in a public health crisis?
I think it was certainly a reasonable use of their time. Well, in principle, I think it was certainly a reasonable use of their time to give press conferences. I think that it was actually a good idea for us to do the press conferences in number 10 with the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister and the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer. I think in principle that was the right thing to do. I was very strongly actually in favour of having the scientists and the medics just explain the reality about what was happening. I think what was not right was the Secretary of State trying to use them essentially as a kind of shield for himself. I think that was unethical and just obviously wrong.
Just moving on to the matter of ethics. As MPs, you know that all MPs have to sign a code of conduct to say that they're going to be honest, that we are going to be transparent, and we're going to be accountable. So do you think that the Prime Minister and other cabinet members, I know you've already expressed your concerns about Matt Hancock, do you think that they were always transparent, honest and accountable to members of the public regarding the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think inevitably it's a mixed bag. I think that the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab did brilliantly. I think Dominic Raab has not got nearly enough credit that he should have done, because he had to step into an extraordinarily difficult situation with the Prime Minister on his deathbed. Now, remember that when Raab took over, there was a conversation in number 10 with the Cabinet Secretary and Lee Kane, the Director of Communications, about calling a cabinet to try and find a replacement for the Prime Minister in case he died. I mean, that's how serious the situation was. And Dominic had to just step into that environment in completely kind of unparalleled. Nobody had dealt with the situation that Dominic Raab faced literally since Churchill in World War II, because you had like crucial elements of the state gone, Prime Minister on his deathbed, crucial people, the Cabinet Secretary ill, blah, blah, blah. So Dominic Raab did an outstanding job. The Chancellor did an outstanding job. I think I've made my views on the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State clear.
So do you think the reason why the Prime Minister didn't sack the Secretary of State was because in doing so, he himself has made very similar mistakes during this pandemic? So in doing so and sacking the Secretary of State would mean that he would have brought his role into disrepute. Do you think that's the reason why the Prime Minister didn't make such a decision?
It's definitely the case that the Prime Minister was told that, contrary to my view, I said sack him. I said sack him like almost every week, sometimes almost every day. He was told, though, that you should not sack him. You should keep him there because he's the person you fire when the inquiry comes along. I thought, my counter-argument to that was, if you leave him there, we're going to have another set of disasters in the autumn. And that's the critical thing. Forget the inquiry. The inquiry, God knows when that'll bloody happen. We've got to get rid of this guy now because every single week, things are going disastrously wrong. Like, it's the whole focus of how to deal with the politics of the inquiry is mental.
So let's just move on to autumn and how the cheering system was introduced. I know you said earlier that the cheering system.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear what you said there. How the what was
Can
it?
you hear me?
Yeah, I didn't hear
cheering
that.
system was introduced, and you said that that was when the government started putting more.
The division bell's ringing here, so it's a bit.
Sorry, the division bell's ringing. The something system is all we heard.
The tiering system.
Oh, tiering.
And how tiering was the beginning of ensuring that there were breaks in place. Did you? How did we get to a point of the tiering system? How was it decided?
Goodness, I mean.
Were you involved in deciding the tiering system, and did you agree when it was proposed?
I was certainly involved with it. In principle, it made sense to have some kind of regional system. If you look at the experience of East Asia, if you have an outbreak in parts of Korea, they don't shut the whole of Korea down, right? They have targeted specific local action to try and hit hotspots. And what I wanted to do was try and get us as close as possible to that kind of a system. Similarly in Britain, in an ideal world, if you have an outbreak in Cornwall, we didn't want to have to be shutting down the north of Scotland, right? We wanted to be able to kind of have a more nuanced approach. In March, we didn't have any testing, we didn't have any proper information, we didn't know anything, so we were completely snookered, and we just had to do a national lockdown. But the whole point of the shift to Plan B, building testing, etc., was we can then move to the East Asian approach where then you can have the testing data gives you testing, sewage data, all of that can come together so you can go fast, hotspot, Cornwall, shut down there, that town, that town, that town, that area, whatever. But, Scotland, carry on. That was the conceptual idea that we had for how to do it. Now, in practice, the way that it was actually worked out and the way that it was actually implemented was, full of holes and extremely problematic, to say the least, in practice. But I think the basic concept has to be right.
Okay, and what were the holes? Do you think the government acted quick enough to implement the restrictions? And what were the holes in the tiering system? Restrictions?
In September.
What were the holes? You talked about having holes in the tiering system and the restriction. What were they?
Oh, well, I mean, it was just, it was put together chaotically, and there were all sorts of problems. Are we doing it by town? Are we doing it by region? If you draw a line there, then will you just get people driving 30 miles to go to a pub across the line? Like lots of things, it was the victim of having to be kind of cobbled together when under time pressure to do things rather than having been thought out earlier on. And also, there's kind of sort of second order and kind of reverberation effects of, because we couldn't get enforcement sorted out properly in various ways, then we couldn't do the kind of very specific hyper-local approach that places like Korea did. Therefore, you have to do them bigger. Therefore, you annoy more people. Therefore, more people drive out of the area, etc., etc. So the whole thing, we just didn't get into the... we basically created it ad hoc because the Prime Minister wouldn't do the kind of let's try and smash it now and get... What should have happened is, what really should have happened is we should never let it get out of control anyway. Once you let it get out of control, then in September we should have smashed it and got control, and then had a career-type, targeted, specific approach.
I think we need to move on. Is that okay, Tara?
Can I just quickly one last question? Just my last question was about, earlier you spoke about the fact that when the furlough system was introduced, that there was no plans with that. So as areas were entering into a new tiering system, was there any financial plan properly drawn up and actual modelling done to think about how areas like that would be funded? Because obviously there was issues around some of the financial support, for example, that was provided to Manchester, where the government was given £8 per person to help support that region. So in preparing for the tiering system, were there thoughts about how this would affect individuals, business and the regions in which we're going under lockdown?
So, in a nutshell, I would say that the Treasury did its best in a very, very difficult situation. But the Treasury had to deal with the fact that Number 10's policy was constantly shifting on the tiering and where the boundaries were, and Prime Minister's conversations with specific people. So the whole thing was just sort of so fast moving and chaotic that there was never any time. You know, there was never. In a nutshell, no, there was not a kind of here it is. We've got an exact plan. We know how we're going to deal with all of these different local areas. That hadn't been worked out in the summer, and therefore it was all kind of bodged together in the autumn, in an environment where the policy was having to be created, the implementation was having to be bodged together, and the Prime Minister was constantly changing his mind about this area or that area, or harder here or less hard there. So the Treasury were kind of constantly playing catch up on it all.
Okay, I think we need to move on. Ty, is it a very brief clarification question?
Does that mean that areas that essentially numbers were just decided just out of somebody's own person, just randomly in someone's head, and when it came to the
there was definitely a lot of crazy randomness in terms of how money was apportioned, and decisions that didn't really make sense. Correct.
Okay, thanks. We're going to go finally to Chris Clarkson, then Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cummings, for your forbearance as we go to the back end of hour number 7. You've already indicated that you think the government was slow off the mark after the advice was given in September that we needed to consider a second national lockdown. Turning to my own constituency, Hayward and Middleton, along with the rest of Greater Manchester, was placed into Tier 2 restrictions on the 14th of October, and then on the 23rd of October moved into Tier 3 restrictions. Do you think the government was acting quick enough to raise tiering and restrictions in areas where there was an obvious increase in cases? If not, why not? And why did you advocate for this tiering system?
Well, I think the simple answer is, take the second question first. As I explained earlier on, the whole point was to try and shift from a world in which you've got no real data and no real understanding in March and no real testing and therefore you're forced to have national measures for everything, to a world in which you've got good testing, you've got good data, and you can be hyper-targeted the way that they are in successful East Asian countries. That was the conceptual approach that we were trying to take. I think that was definitely the right approach to take. You know, after all, that is the way in which the countries that have been most successful on the face of the planet have done it. So I think the kind of direction was correct. It was just that, you know, like lots of things, the thinking was done too late, and operationally it was not done well.
So I would agree with some operational inconsistencies. For example, in Liverpool, when they went into Tier 3, personal care facilities like gyms stayed open. In Greater Manchester, they were closed. Who built that into the model?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay. And very quickly, I mean, it sounds like you gave quite a lot of advice during this entire process, and according to you, most of it was disregarded. Why did you stay on? If you had the opportunity to be a whistleblower rather than a whistleblower without a whistle, why didn't you step out of government earlier and call out what you saw as these egregious breaches?
Well, as I said, I thought about it a few times. I discussed it with senior people. I discussed it with the Cabinet Secretary and others. These decisions can be often difficult. And, you know, I'd watched the March situation, and then I'd watched how he decided that basically he wished that he'd never done lockdown and he should have been bounced into it and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I was extremely tempted to go in the summer, but various people said to me, the autumn is going to be a disaster. He's in complete let-it-rip mode, just open everything up, keep the beaches open. You've got to stay and try and control the shopping trolley, otherwise God knows what's going to happen. And I think part of the problem was people thought that, like in 2019, a lot of people thought, like in 2019, I had a lot of influence over the Prime Minister and a lot of things he would do what I said. And whilst that had been the case in 2019, from 10 o'clock on election night, as soon as he had an 80-seat majority, that situation changed almost immediately. As I said, I think I definitely should have gone in September, without any shadow of a doubt in my mind now. The reason why I didn't was because it was clear that we were heading for another disaster and there was going to be another whole set of meetings. And I thought, well, maybe I'll be able to force this through.
Irrespective of what other people thought about your influence, clearly at this stage you must have reasonably assumed that you didn't have the type of influence that you thought you did. In fact, you said as much after 10 o'clock on December the 12th. So surely the logical thing then would have been to take an alternative course of action.
Well, as I said, I think I'm half agreeing with you. I think I definitely should have gone in September.
And what do you think the outcome would have been if you had?
I don't know, but as I said, 20 minutes ago, I think it was one of those gambles that was worth doing because my relations with him were already broken. At the latest, I was going to stay there until Friday the 18th of December, so we were only talking about 12 weeks anyway. If I gambled then and said, I will basically call a press conference and blow this thing sky high, and then he'd caved in and done it, then tens of thousands of people would now still be alive, and we could have avoided the whole horror of the delays and the variants and Christmas and the nightmare that the country's gone through in the first quarter of this year. So as I tried to say, I think I made the wrong decision, and I apologise for that.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. And the final member is Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Cummings, for your time today. And I really appreciate it because we've had far longer with you than we've ever had to be able to scrutinise the Secretary of State or the Prime Minister. And I think that is a real problem. Moving on to that, I've just got a few quick questions. You've accused Matt Hancock of lying repeatedly. Will you publish the evidence publicly today?
I'll definitely have a look at evidence that I've got. I think in general, it's better not to get into the business of publishing people's private messages and WhatsApps, and I don't want to embarrass and make, some of these people are in position now, and publishing WhatsApps with the Cabinet Secretary and people like that is a very big step. What I think should happen, I think far better than me randomly throwing WhatsApps out on the internet, is that you, the MPs, should force the government. MPs have the power to force the government to face this reality and to discuss the things which I've discussed today. You have the power to do that, and what should happen is that the MPs force this situation.
We have that power.
Sarah, I do think it's important that if as serious an accusation as lying is made, that should be corroborated after this hearing. There are other things that can hang in the air, but I think that is a specific requirement.
Perhaps it could just be evidence given to the committee and not published on the internet.
Well, I'm sure the committee will find a way to receive.
I'm happy to discuss that process. Also, obviously, I have to take some legal advice on the whole thing as well, and about the public inquiry and whatnot. But I think that people like the former Cabinet Secretary and others should be here in the seat like me, under oath, explaining what happened, and like me saying what we think we got right and what we think we got wrong.
Thank you, Mr Cummings. I'm going to move on to procurement because you mentioned it several times as being chaotic and not fit for purpose and was something that you wanted to change before the pandemic. Now that falls under the Cabinet Office. Do you think Michael Gove is culpable in any of the chaos that you had described around PPE procurement or any of the contracts that have been dished out around COVID and our response to COVID?
I don't think really that Gove had a huge amount of responsibility in a sense for this. I mean, there are officials in the Cabinet Office, yes, who were in charge of certain aspects of this, but procurement is not just done centrally from the Cabinet Office. Every department is running its own procurement operation. So what happened during the COVID crisis is that some parts of procurement exercises inside DH were pulled out of DH and given to the Cabinet Office to run. That is correct. But it's not as if, it's not like Gove is in charge of government procurement.
He's the minister responsible for the department in government which is responsible for procurement. Are you saying that he shares no burden of blame in this situation at all?
I mean, I'm sure that he would say, like all of us involved, like all senior, I don't think there's a single senior person involved with this who would say that they didn't make some serious mistakes in this, and I'm sure Michael would say the same, that he made mistakes on it. But at the heart of, we went into the crisis with the wrong system, and everybody had to kind of try and bodge your way through that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the issue of lockdowns. Who in the Cabinet was a block or a delay on the second lockdown or was sceptical about lockdowns in general?
I don't remember the Cabinet being involved in the discussion.
There was no discussion about the second lockdown with the Cabinet. It was entirely the Prime Minister.
Not in a meaningful way. As I said, I mean, I never attended Cabinet in 2020. I tried to keep out of political stuff. I didn't attend Cabinet. I mean, the way that Cabinet works now, it's largely a Potemkin exercise. So I saved my time and didn't want to go. I didn't also attend PMQ's meetings all year either. First time I saw PMQ's was a couple of weeks ago, since the election. So there may have been a kind of one of the Potemkin Cabinet meetings about the lockdown, but I was in the meetings where it was actually decided, and it was just the Prime Minister, and it was the Prime Minister, Cabinet Secretary, Valence, Whitty, me, and other officials there arguing this stuff out, and it was the Prime Minister's decision. So there may have been a Cabinet meeting, but that was just for show, not as a relevant part of the decision-making process. Unless I've completely forgotten some Cabinet that was significant.
Thank you. You've told the committee that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, was totally supportive of lockdown in 2020. That's a pretty interesting statement and endorsement from you, given that you've been pretty scathing of other ministers. Did the Chancellor provide scientific evidence or medical advice to back up the safety of his scheme, which literally had his name on it, Eat Out to Help Out?
As I said before, I wasn't really involved with the Eat Out to Help Out thing, so I don't really have very much useful to say about it. I'm just for complete clarity on what I'm saying about the Chancellor and lockdown. There have been stories saying that he was a kind of block and tried to throw mud in the gears, and him and the Treasury were trying to stop the first lockdown. What I was saying was there were powerful voices in the Treasury who were saying the real danger here is economic and we shouldn't do this. But in the meetings that I had, the Chancellor never tried to stop that happening. And in fact, when I went through with him Plan B and said, here's what I think we should do, we've been given this thing where it's either wave 1 or it's wave 2, let's shift to Plan B and try and build all of this stuff and escape. The Chancellor was completely supportive. And in fact, what I ought to have said earlier on and forgot, one of the key architects of that Plan B was actually the Chancellor's Chief Economic Advisor, Mike Webb. He worked with Ben Warner and Mark Warner on, trying to figure out what the hell this Plan B looked like. So those stories are false. It's in the autumn, The Chancellor was extremely sceptical of what Hancock and Department of Health were saying, but his scepticism, he could appreciate my argument about where I was coming from. His argument was, A, there is no plan from the Department for Health on what we do next. Secondly, we cannot be in a situation where we just constantly trolley from one side to another. Eat out to help out, get everybody back to work, lockdown again, circuit breaker, stay at home. Then 3 weeks' time, the Prime Minister because we were having this discussion, the Prime Minister was like, well, we can do this for 2 weeks and then, we'll tell everyone to come back. And the Chancellor was saying quite rightly, the economy doesn't work like that. If you're going to say to people now, we're going to have to do another lockdown, you have to realise that a lot of people are going to conclude the government's lost control of the situation. They told everybody to work from home before, then they told everyone not to work from home. Now they're telling everyone there's going to be another lockdown. A lot of businesses are basically going to say that's it until the spring, and they're going to shut the doors. And you need to understand that. And Hancock and Department for Health don't have any plan for that. And we can't just keep careering around backwards and forwards like this, otherwise we're going to have complete bedlam. And that was the core. So what the Chancellor was begging for was finally a consistent plan that we could stick to for more than 2 days without being knocked off course by the Telegraph.
Thank you. So the reports from September 2020 that the Prime Minister did not impose a new lockdown over fears that Rishi Sunak would quit are untrue, are they?
Completely, 100% correct. I know I was there. The Chancellor never threatened to quit, and he didn't tell me at the time. I had private meetings with him about the situation and about all the difficulties of it. He said to me, for God's sake, please don't you quit. I mean, I know you want to, but don't. That story is definitely false, and he was definitely not throwing around resignation threats. He was just desperate for a plan that was coherent and the government could stick to, and like lots of us, was just completely at his wit's end about the shopping trolley.
I think some people might ask whether you're hedging your bets slightly with an eye on a future administration run by Rishi Sunak. Is that out of...
I think everyone, from my wife to everybody in Westminster and Whitehall, will agree that the less everyone hears of me in the future, the better.
Thank you. So, why do you think the government are blocking a COVID inquiry now? And do you think that the 128,000 people that have lost their lives and their loved ones deserves answers now?
Yes, as I've said all day today, I think they do deserve answers now. I think it's genuinely terrible, the idea of trying to punt this all off till after the next election. When you have a crisis this bad, you've got to face reality. And the fact that the government, I mean, it's beyond absurd. We're in a situation where millions of people watched the government have an official policy last March, and now Number 10 is just trying to claim that it didn't exist. Now, my point is, if they've lost the plot that badly in there, what on earth else is going on in that building?
Thank you. This one's quite specific. You tweeted and have spoken today about the unwillingness to learn from East and Southeast Asian countries because people were saying, and I quote, "Asians all do what they're told, so it won't work here." Who said that? And how much do you think that this outdated racist stereotyping has contributed to the numbers of deaths in the UK?
I don't want to kind of get into quoting things like that because I think it would be unfair, and I think it would be unfair on some of the scientists and others involved in it. I think it's undoubtedly the case that there was a general view. I wrote about this, I think, in 2014 or something, about the Department for Education. There is a general problem in Whitehall of parochialism, that people don't want to look at what's happening abroad. And there is a specific issue about thinking that we can't really learn from East Asia. And that has been around for many, many years. It undoubtedly I think actually a lot of senior people would openly admit to you. We all know what the conversations were in January and February. I mean, I've got WhatsApps between me and all kinds of senior people. The view was that the public won't accept lockdown, and the public won't accept the kind of surveillance, the whole kind of test and trace infrastructure. And my argument and others' argument was, actually, if you look at somewhere like Taiwan, you've got a very, really a very small but serious curtailment of civil liberties in some ways. If you want to go in and out of the country, you are quarantined. They don't have a joke system like we've got. You are in a hotel, it's patrolled, you're not leaving, forget it. It's ultra serious. But then if you walk around Taiwan, it's basically life is, I've got friends who live there, life's basically normal. If you're faced with the choices of massive wave killing hundreds of thousands, or that, I think almost everybody in this country would say, let's go down that route. And that's the route that we should have started to go down in January. We started to think about that in mid-March, but it took a few months really for that new thinking to kind of develop into real policy and develop into real operational capabilities in certain ways. But you don't change big cultural barriers like that about learning from abroad quickly, and I think it'll take time for Whitehall to adapt.
Thank you, and this is my last question. You've described the PM's running of Number 10 as chaotic, incompetent, lacking judgment at times. Do you think Boris Johnson is a fit and proper person to get us through this pandemic?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just reflecting on the autumn and the winter, we're approaching this with hindsight, clearly, as we do everything. What we do know that happened was that there was a Kent variant that has contributed most of the deaths since the summer, but we didn't know about it in September. And in evidence to the Science Select Committee, the chair of NERVTAG, Professor Peter Horby, on the 23rd of December, was asked if the government had acted in a timely way. And he said, I think they have. We sent our first note to them, raising a significant concern on the 18th of December, and on the 19th, measures were put in place. So this is at odds with the kind of repeated cycle of delay in inaction that you're describing, is it not?
I don't think that's right, no, because although the specifics about Kent may only have come up at that time, it was certainly the case that variants were being discussed in September. I had scientists say to me in September that one of the reasons why we've got to not let this get out of control is the problem with variants. So it was, if I knew about it in September, that means that other people definitely were talking about it well before then.
But not a specific variant, it was a concern about variants in general.
I can't remember the detail of my conversations now on variants, but it's certainly the case. I had specific warnings from scientists, and not just any old scientists who'd been repeatedly proved right. So I took what they said particularly carefully. Now, I was looking back over the whole thing and doing a kind of scorecard of who's been right about this and who's been wrong about it. And the people who were right about it said to me in September, watch out for this variants thing. It could suddenly get very nasty. You could have a really, really serious problem with it. And the same people who were right about that in September, the reason why I brought the issue up recently publicly was because the same people were saying the same thing to me in January, saying the government is not acting properly. We still don't have a proper border policy.
The committee has taken extensive evidence on variants, and you will know that variants arise all the time in their thousands. That's the nature of viruses. And so, given that we were in September, we now have the benefit of the hindsight that tells us that we know about there was a particularly dangerous variant, infectious variant, the Kent variant. We also know that we have vaccines that in September and October were not approved for use. So would it have been reasonable, based on a generalised concern about variants, not a specific concern that one had been discovered that was very infectious, isn't to impose lockdown restrictions without any particular intelligence as to a variant that required it, would that not have been a recipe for permanent lockdown?
But with respect, that's not at all the situation that we actually faced. In September, the argument was not at all about variants. It was about the existing case. And the point was that we were going to have to lock down in 5 weeks because of the existing variant. It wasn't about variant. The argument in September wasn't lockdown now preemptively because of variants. The argument in September was the data on current hospitalisations, current cases, ICUs, blah, 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 is all completely clear. You are going to have to lock down at the end of October to stop the NHS being washed away again. And the whole lesson of this situation is, once you get to a position like that, there's only two logical positions. Logical position A is, deep breath, forget it, we're going to let the wave crash and it's going to be what it's going to be. Option B is, we're not going to do that, that's inconceivable, the risks of it are too high, therefore we're going to have to lock down. As soon as you make the decision that we're going to have to lock down, you do it today. Because that's what exponential curves are. The faster you act, then the faster you get on top of it, and then the faster it exponentially decays. And that means you don't have to have it in place for as long, it doesn't have to be so deep, and everything else. That was what the number 10 data team was saying to the Prime Minister in September, and what the Chief Scientist and the Chief Medical Officer were saying. It wasn't anything to do with variants, and that is exactly what happened. When we all came back on Friday the 31st, and we looked at the data, it was basically what Catherine Cutts had read out 5 weeks earlier. That's why the Prime Minister was so enraged by the situation, because he knew that me and others were looking at him saying, you know, you were told. Catherine Cutts read out all of this information to you, and that's what we're now looking at. And now you're doing it again, and now the lockdown's going to have to be worse, the destruction is going to be worse, and that means thousands of people have caught it in the intervening 5 weeks who are now going to die. And we're doing the lockdown anyway, and we're going to trash the economy more anyway.
So in that circumstance, before we had vaccines that had been approved, quite a long time before they were approved, with that rise in infections, what your advice would have been would be to engage in a series of lockdowns to keep infections at a low enough level for an indeterminate future. Would that be right?
So I left before the kind of big conversations with variants happened. As I said, I had some conversations about variants in September at the latest, possibly even August, I can't remember now. I mean, my view was, in September, if you whack it now hard, then we get on top of it. And also remember, at that time, we were in the process, I was spending a very large part of each day and each weekend working on the mass testing thing. So you're having these things kind of balanced out, and I was saying to the PM, look, okay, we've totally screwed it up, and we should have been doing this mass testing since March, but we didn't realise until July. Okay, we're now pushing everything we possibly can behind it. The Cabinet Secretary is doing a brilliant job. He's pushing all the officials behind it. If we smash it now in September, then we've got a chance to, then when we come out in a month's time, to come out with millions of these tests starting to be available. And then the game could be different. And the tests can also help in terms of dealing with the variants. That was the fundamental argument in September.
Testing
and if we'd done that
was the extra variable.
If we'd done that in September and really got control of it, then you wouldn't have seen this great spike, and then which we only just start to sort of see to come down in October. And then he said, oh, well, now we've got to come out of it. We can't keep this going anymore. And then, of course, then the variant kicks off, but from a very high level. If we crushed it in September, then by the time the variants came along, we'd have been in a fundamentally different position. Okay. And this is not hindsight. James Phillips and others, Patrick Vallance, were saying this argument in September.
I think we should conclude, but this is a lessons learned inquiry, as we said some hours ago at the beginning, and we've taken a lot of evidence from a lot of different people. This is the penultimate session before we write our report. Just reflecting back on your time in Downing Street dealing with the pandemic, what are the key lessons that you would learn that, as in the way of lessons, can be applied?
I think there's a general principle of making things like SAGE and scientific advice more open. I think there's an obvious question about responsibility, like a really fundamental question about how the British state works, about power between ministers and officials, and who is actually in charge of things and who can actually form teams. In normal government business, the assumption is, well, we can just all we can all live with a bit of friction to have this kind of division of responsibilities and muddle along. But it's completely fatal when you're dealing with a really serious thing. Because when you're dealing with a really serious thing like this, you need to get a great team that knows exactly what the goal is and exactly who's responsible for what. And the Whitehall culture of how responsibility is deliberately diffused is intrinsically hostile to high-performance management. Intrinsically hostile. If you put Bill Gates himself, any great people from history who really understand how to run these kind of teams, all of them would say the first time you put them in the job, they're like, how the hell am I supposed to manage that? If I can't pick who the team is, and I can't fire them, and I can't bring people in. That connects to the general, if there's one change that you can make in terms of the civil service, there should be, the HR system should change so that all appointments with a tiny fraction of national security oddities, which are not really relevant, fundamentally 99+% of civil service jobs should be open by default. The competition for them should be open by default. We've got so many brilliant people in this country. And then we have a civil service system which literally puts a massive barrier and says, we're going to recruit all of these things from internally, like a caste system. It's completely crackers' way of doing things. Again, during this thing, we had to go out and get external people to come in and provide all kinds of crucial skills. But that shouldn't be just something that you do because there's a crisis. The British system should be open so that we can get the best people in the country to the best jobs. Now, I know from conversations that there are lots of senior people who agree with me, but parts of Whitehall will fight to the death to stop a culture of open by default jobs. But I think if you're going to make one change in the system, that's one of the most crucial. And the other thing is really thinking hard about incentives, because people are not incentivized to tell the truth. They're not incentivized to think through hard problems. They're not incentivized for operational delivery. People are incentivized to keep their heads down, to back up the system when it fails. And the culture is that senior people are constantly appointed to jobs on the basis of, are they a good chap? Are they going to, not rock the boat? Actually being really, really good at your job and operational delivery when it counts is not taken seriously. Everyone wants to have stupid words like strategy in their job titles. But the people who actually get things done are not respected, often inside the system. So that's a huge point, and that connects finally to, I would say, the culture, the meeting culture of how we do things. Over and over again in this crisis, we would just about get to the point where the crucial thing would be exposed, and some senior person in terror would say, let's take this offline. And I would sometimes shout, no, let's not take it offline. Let's keep it online. We're just almost about to get to the bloody point. But you've got this culture constantly in which things are elided away, let's not embarrass anybody, let's not really get to the heart of the problem. And again, that's normal in Whitehall, but when you're dealing with a problem like this, it's a complete and utter disaster.
And you fell into that trap yourself, you said this morning.
Yeah, we were all in these ludicrous meetings with people saying, take it offline, take it offline, take it offline.
Okay. Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving evidence today for over 7 hours. That is really appreciated. I just want to ask you finally about one of your last comments, which is that the Prime Minister is not fit and proper to do his job. And I just want to ask you about your own record, about which you've been admirably honest today. When you think that you were someone who attended SAGE, who was known to take a great interest in science, but it wasn't until March the 11th that you advised the Prime Minister that we needed to change direction. It then took more than 2 months after that before we had a test and trace system set up. You then didn't win the argument for the circuit breaker in September. We didn't have weekly testing of NHS staff until the end of November, applying exactly the same standards, do you think you did your job in a fit and proper way last year?
I think there's no doubt whatsoever that there's many thousands of people in this country who could have done my job much better than me. That's unarguable.
You've been very critical of many individuals and indeed the apparatus of the state. As Jeremy said at the beginning of the hearing, you were very clear that the advice that Sage had given was advice that was then followed by the government. You hadn't attended the COBRA meetings or some of the
I didn't say, with respect, I didn't quite exactly say that. I said I can't remember exactly what meetings I attended. It's possible I did attend some of the COBRA meetings in February, but I was certainly paying close attention to it, and not attending some of the COBRA meetings chaired by Hancock is not a sign of not taking something seriously.
But I think you accept from the evidence that we've heard that you should have, I think in your view, done more to assert the case that you became convinced of earlier.
Undoubtedly the case.
So we all operate through hindsight. Last spring you edited your blog to better be able to claim foresight with the benefit of hindsight.
No, that's
Do you think you're falling into that trap, which is a very human trap here?
With respect, that's not what I did. I think that I think that when you have these kind of groupthink episodes, like, kind of by definition, the reason why they happen is because you have certain kind of ideas take hold, and you have an institutional setting in which people who understand why those things are wrong are kind of excluded from the process. And that's what happened. The lesson of that is, as I said earlier on, is openness, because the people who alerted me to this were not people inside the system. It was people like Mark Warner who came to me and said, hang on a second, there's something terribly, terribly wrong with this. And I think that shows that shows the scale of the problem and the nature of it as well. If this had been exposed even a few weeks earlier than it was, then the whole story, I think, would have been different. I did go to people. I did try and get outside help. This was, of course, portrayed in the media as terrible Cummings tries to influence Sage, and why is he even attending Sage and everything else. But I took the view that I ought to listen to Sage meetings in February. I ought to try and understand this as well as I could do. I could sense that there was that the communications between Sage, Department for Health, Cabinet Office and background to number 10 were failing, was my sense. That sense proved to be correct. It clearly was massively and radically failing. But if I'd gone to people earlier, if I'd gone to outside people earlier, then I would have realised earlier that we were all making a big mistake.
As my co-chair, Jeremy Hunt, said, you've been very generous with your time. This is a lessons learned inquiry. We'll, in 2 weeks tomorrow, hear from the Health Secretary. There are various points that you've agreed that you will follow up in writing with the committee, so we look forward to that. And then we will reflect on all of the evidence that you've given today when it comes to our report to Parliament. That concludes the session of the Joint Committee. Order, order.
Thank you.
Well, there you are. We have heard more than 7 hours of evidence from Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, during which he has painted a picture of a government in chaos, an incompetent prime minister who's not a fit and proper person to lead the country through the pandemic, and a health secretary that should have been sacked repeatedly. It was a damning assessment of the UK's response to Covid-19, with Mr Cummings saying when the public needed us most, the government failed. Speaking to MPs on the Health and Science Select Committees, Mr Cummings said it is completely crackers that Mr Johnson is Prime Minister, claiming that Boris Johnson initially dismissed COVID as a scare story. He described the government as lions led by donkeys and said Health Secretary Matt Hancock should have been sacked for lying. Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's in Westminster. An extraordinary number of explosive claims, John. Let's begin with those about Matt Hancock, shall we? Very clear in Dominic Cummings' evidence that there are allies and there are enemies. Number one at the top of that list, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock.
It was a brutal demolition job on Mr. Hancock. He mentioned him. There was even a little jibe, did you notice, right at the end when he talked about not attending SAGE meetings, not just because Mr. Hancock wasn't there or whatever. Yes, I mean, he really was Mr. Cummings' #1 target. As you've said, there was criticism of the Prime Minister, but there were some pretty damning charges about Mr. Hancock, telling lies in meetings, incompetence in PPE contracts and other things. He claimed that the Cabinet Secretary at the time, Sir Mark Sedwill, had urged the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock. And yet later on, as a lot of MPs were presumably thinking, oh, is Mr. Hancock being set up as the fall guy here? Well, Mr. Cummings seemed to confirm that view because he suggested that the PM was not sacking Mr. Hancock because he wanted to get rid of him and for him to be the fall guy when it comes to the public inquiry that the Prime Minister has promised. So tomorrow, I can tell you, Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Health Secretary, has secured another urgent question to the Health Secretary on the government's handling and preparedness for the pandemic. Mr. Hancock is due to answer earlier this week, Monday, was it Monday? Earlier this week, Mr. Hancock sent Nadeem Zahawi along to answer in his place, much to the annoyance of Mr. Ashworth. Now, if Mr. Hancock ducks that, dodges that, sends either Ed Arger, a health minister, or Mr. Zahawi again, that will not look good, and it will look as though Mr. Hancock is in huge political trouble, not feeling able to come to the House of Commons and defend himself. You could argue that if he's wise, Mr. Hancock will come out fighting, hit back at all the allegations Mr. Cummings has made today. Or he may take the view he doesn't want to get into a slanging match with Mr. Cummings. Prime Minister's questions today, it was very noticeable that the Prime Minister barely mentioned Mr. Cummings at all. He came out fighting, but his target was Sir Keir Starmer, not Mr. Cummings. Now, Mr. Johnson denied the charge, which was repeated by Sir Keir Starmer at PMQs, that Sir Mark Sedwill had called on the PM to sack Mr. Hancock because, as Mr. Cummings put it, he had lost faith in Mr. Hancock's honesty. But there were other questions put by the Labour leader that Mr. Johnson ducked. But the politician who is really in the firing line tonight, more than any other, is Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. It doesn't look good. He's obviously just Mr. Cummings' allegations, and we await Mr. Hancock's response. Interestingly, hardly any criticism of Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and the criticisms of Boris Johnson, well, I'm sure he's made those criticisms before. He said at one point that when you compare that the electorate were faced with a choice of Mr. Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn at the 2019 general election, not a great choice, he said. But to accuse Mr. Hancock of being a liar and say the Cabinet Secretary wanted him sacked, these are serious charges. And the support for Mr. Hancock was pretty lukewarm from number 10 at the number 10 briefing this afternoon. Yes, the PM has confidence in him, but he just talked about how they were working, the PM and Mr. Hancock were working together. Mr. Johnson at PMQs could have said, Mr. Hancock's doing a great job. He didn't. So it looks pretty bad for Mr. Hancock tonight. Let's wait and see if he comes out fighting.
Yeah, the Health Secretary will have his turn before the committee in the next couple of weeks, John. But in the meantime, let's have a listen to what Dominic Cummings had to say about him today.
The Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly. I said repeatedly to the Prime Minister that he should be fired. So did the Cabinet Secretary, so did many other senior people. There are numerous examples. I mean, in the summer, he said that everyone who needed treatment, who got the treatment that they required. He knew that that was a lie, because he'd been briefed by the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer himself about the first peak, and we were told explicitly people did not get the treatment that they deserved. Many people were left to die in horrific circumstances. Just before the Prime Minister and I were diagnosed with having COVID ourselves, the Secretary of State for Health told us in the Cabinet room, everything is fine on PPE. We've got it all covered, etc., etc. When I came back, almost the first meeting I had in the Cabinet room was about the disaster over PPE and how we were actually completely sure that hospitals all over the country were running out. Secretary of State said in that meeting, this is the fault of Simon Stevens, it's the fault of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's not my fault, they've blocked approvals on all sorts of things. I said to the Cabinet Secretary, please investigate this and find out if it's true. The Cabinet Secretary came back to me and said, it's completely untrue. I have lost confidence in the Secretary of State's honesty in these meetings.
Later in his evidence, he gave a possible explanation for why the Prime Minister didn't sack Matt Hancock.
The Prime Minister was told that, contrary to my view, I said sack him. I said sack him almost every week, sometimes almost every day. He was told, though, that you should not sack him. You should keep him there because he's the person you fire when the inquiry comes along. I thought, my counter-argument to that was, if you leave him there, we're going to have another set of disasters in the autumn. And that's the critical thing. Forget the inquiry. The inquiry, God knows when that'll bloody happen. We've got to get rid of this guy now because every single week, things are going disastrously wrong.
And what about the Prime Minister? Well, Mr Cummings claimed that at the start of last year, as COVID-19 spread around the world, Boris Johnson had failed to grasp the seriousness of the situation.
The Prime Minister's view throughout January, February, March was, as he said in many meetings, the real danger here is not the disease. The real danger here is the measures that we take to deal with the disease and the economic destruction that will cause. He had that view all the way through. In fact, one of the reasons why it was so rocky getting from the 14th, when we suggested Plan B to him, to actual lockdown, was because he kept basically bouncing back to, we don't really know how dangerous it is, we're going to completely destroy the economy by having lockdown, maybe we shouldn't do it.
Dominic Cummings also gave a new reason for his trip to Durham last year. He said security threats to his family had forced the move, but that leaving this information out after his Rose Garden explanation had been a huge mistake.
On the 28th of February, when I was dealing with the COVID problem, on the Friday night, I was down in Westminster, and my wife called saying there's a gang of people outside saying they're going to break into the house and kill everybody inside. She was alone at the house at the time with our then 3-year-old. On the 22nd of March, the story happened, which the lady mentioned earlier, about that fake quote from me, basically implying that I was happy for everyone to die, which led to further problems. After that weekend, I then said to my wife, right, we've been discussing it for a month. We've got to get out of here on Friday. So before the whole thing happened with the Prime Minister being sick, my wife calling up on the Friday and everything else, it had already been decided that I was going to move my family out of London, regardless of the COVID rules. We had a kind of chaotic situation in number 10 where the Prime Minister said, we're going to have to do something, you're going to have to explain something. And I said, I'm not explaining these security things, otherwise I'm going to have everyone mobs back outside my house. So I ended up giving the whole Rose Garden thing, where what I said was true, but we left out a kind of crucial part of it all. And the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and then it undermined public confidence in the whole thing.
His testimony was littered with criticisms of the Prime Minister, in particular when discussing the need for a second lockdown in the autumn.
If you took anybody at random from the kind of top 1% competent people in this country and presented them with the situation, they would have behaved differently to how the Prime Minister behaved.
So, if we're describing his behaviour at that point, was it driven by arrogance, complacency, or was it something more sinister?
No, he just didn't. I think there's a great misunderstanding people have that because it nearly killed him, therefore he must have taken it seriously. But in fact, after the first lockdown, his view was he was cross with me and for others into what he regarded as basically pushing him into the first lockdown. His argument after that happened was, literally, quote, "I should have been the mayor of Jaws and kept the beaches open." That's what he said on many occasions. So he didn't think in July or September, thank goodness we were pushed, thank goodness we did the first lockdown, it was obviously the right thing to do, etc., etc. His argument then was, we shouldn't have done the first lockdown and I'm not going to make the same mistake again.
And what of that infamous "let the bodies pile high" comment? Well, Dominic Cummings insisted that Boris Johnson did say it during discussions over another lockdown. It is a comment that the Prime Minister has flatly denied making.
Did you hear him say, "let the bodies pile high in their thousands," or "it's only killing 80-year-olds"?
There's been a few different versions of these stories knocking around. There was a version of it in the Sunday Times, which was not accurate, but the version that the BBC reported was accurate.
And you heard that?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Asked about his own responsibility, Dominic Cummings expressed regret for not taking more drastic action to force the PM to call a second lockdown as his time in Downing Street was coming to an end.
Fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions and push other things through against his wishes. What I ought to have done is said to him then, I'm resigning in 48 hours. We can do this one way or we can do this the other way. If you announce that you're going to have a lockdown and take serious action now, I will leave, go quietly, we're all friends. If you don't, I'll call a press conference and say, the Prime Minister's making a terrible decision that's going to kill thousands of people. And I should have gambled on holding a gun to his head, essentially.
Well, let's turn to John Craig in Westminster for us. The latter part of the evidence was all about the government decision-making in the run-up to the autumn lockdowns. Why this is important, John, of course, because more people lost their lives in the second wave than the first wave, and it was particularly damning on the Prime Minister's decision-making.
Yes, and just on the penultimate clip we heard there, where Mr Cummings claimed he did hear the Prime Minister talk about being prepared to see the bodies pile high. That is very significant because it was, let me think, it was the last Prime Minister's questions in April that Sir Keir Starmer asked Boris Johnson if he had made that remark. And the Prime Minister had said no, he denied it. And I remember Sir Keir, in a very lawyerly way, as he would, said, right, we'll leave that there. So the Prime Minister has denied in Parliament making that remark. Now Mr Cummings has said that he heard it. So we all know the consequences for willfully or deliberately misleading the House of Commons land the Prime Minister in serious trouble. But yes, I mean we had to wait a long time, obviously, to get to the crucial period of the autumn lockdown. You remember there was the leak and the news conference brought forward to Saturday and everything. That was a very contentious part of the whole evidence. Incidentally, my colleague Joe Pike has calculated he must have had his stopwatch out because he's told us the hearing was 7 hours and 7 minutes. I suppose we should commend Mr Cummings on his stamina. I also thought he stayed very composed throughout the whole thing. He never got rattled or tetchy with any of the MPs asking him questions. Very calm and composed. Having said that, this is the reaction a short time ago from Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow the Shadow Health Secretary, who hopes to confront Matt Hancock in the House of Commons tomorrow in an urgent question. This is Mr Ashworth responding to the claims made by Mr Cummings today.
What we've heard today from Dominic Cummings is a shocking testimony, revealing chaos, lack of grip, incompetence and abdication of leadership at the very top of government when we were facing the biggest emergency since the Second World War. He's made some very grave allegations against Matt Hancock, which on the face of it look well-founded. Matt Hancock must come to the House of Commons tomorrow and explain what he did to protect care homes, because so many people did die in care homes, what he did to get the PPE to the front line, what he did on testing and tracing, because it didn't work, still doesn't work to this day. These are serious allegations which Matt Hancock now needs to give us an explanation for if the public is to maintain confidence in him.
So, Jonathan Ashworth there giving the Health Secretary notice of the questions he wants to ask in his urgent question in the Commons tomorrow. Of course, then there's the allegation about the Cabinet Secretary recommending he should be fired, and the lying that Mr Cummings was talking about. So what happens now is there is an urgent question. Will Mr Hancock turn up? As Jeremy Hunt said at the end, he's due to appear before that committee in 2 weeks' time, and then they will produce their report.
John, thank you.